Ladies and gentlemen, excuse me again. It's always seems to be me. How come Bob never gets to interrupt anybody? So it always seems to be me that interrupts your conversations. But look, while breakfast is still being served, and please do continue to eat, I'd like to keep the morning moving, and so I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Leena Srivastava. Please welcome me in joining her to the stage.
Very good morning to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us here so early on a morning. I believe that it is the normal practice in Australia and India at 9:30 in the morning. It is difficult to get people into a room. So it's a real pleasure. Thank you very much. I would also like to thank the Queensland University, Rio Tinto, and the Energy Institute for hosting this event and for having me here. It's a real privilege to be able to share with you some thoughts on the challenge of energy access that the world is facing. I don't look upon it as a challenge for India or some of the other countries that have this challenge. I think it's a global challenge that needs to be addressed at a global level. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why the Sustainable Energy for All initiative, amongst its 3 goals, has at the forefront the provision of clean energy access or access to modern fuels. We don't use the word clean. Can come back to that later. To all by 2030. So that's a very ambitious target, which was defined in the year 2010. We are already in the year 2014. 4 years have gone by. We have about 16 years left to be able to achieve that target, and it is not going to be a simple task unless we all come together and do something about it. So in the last 4 years, there's been a lot of mobilization of interest, of some levels of support for this particular goal. And I guess engagement at a country level, but substantial progress is yet to come forward, but I hope that, we will be able to do that. And just for purposes of completing the Sustainable Energy for All story, for those of you who may not be aware, the other 2 goals relate to doubling the share of renewable energy in the total energy mix in the same time period, which is by the year 2030, and doubling the rate of energy efficiency improvements in the time period 2010 to 2030 as compared to what we had achieved in the last 40 years between 1970 and 2010. All 3 are very ambitious targets. In my view, the most easily done, relatively speaking, is the one on renewables. Energy access and energy efficiency, I think it's a toss-up because energy efficiency is something that we've all been focusing on for a long while, but haven't again really even exploited what are called the low-hanging fruit in these areas. So all very difficult challenges, but at least the energy agenda is center stage as far as the UN is concerned. And I think that should give us all hope. So let me move to the topic of our discussion today. I was asked to speak about meeting the future energy needs and alleviating the plight of about 800 million energy impoverished in India. And let me start by just a brief recap. Amongst the population, typically when we are talking about energy poverty or lack of access to energy, we are talking about electricity and cooking fuels and for lighting and cooking purposes. But I think productive use, as Gautam was mentioning last night, is an equally important part of bringing people out of poverty. And here are some statistics put out by the World Energy Organization on populations without access to electricity. And you can see that developing Asia has a pretty large number of people without access to electricity, and we match up, I think, with sub-Saharan Africa. But if you look at the densities of populations without access to electricity, I think we beat sub-Saharan Africa hollow. Largest population relying on traditional use of biomass. On electrification, China has done very well. On provision of clean cooking energy forms, I don't think they have done as well, so you see them right there next to India, with a fairly large population without access to clean cooking energy forms. And this is possibly a much more difficult challenge that we are facing, and I'll come back to that in just a few minutes. We have about, at a global level, 560 million households that still rely on traditional biomass. That's 40% of global population. And there is obviously a very strong link between income levels and the energy poverty levels, which is what is being highlighted over here. Having addressed the challenges in the few minutes that I have, I'm going to talk about what is it that we have been doing in this area as TERI, as the organization that I'm representing, and what is it that this experience brings out for all of us to take a look at. Very quickly, I'm starting with cooking energy over here. This is a typical scene in most homes which are using traditional cook stoves and traditional fuels to meet their energy requirements. You know, it's for some of us, it would be virtually impossible to be inside that room because we wouldn't be able to tolerate the smoke. And the latest report from the World Health Organization that was released, I think last week, has attributed the fact that air pollution to the single highest environmental health risk, to providing the single highest environmental health risk. And they've estimated that air pollution kills about 7 million people every year, which is roughly half of these is due to the fumes from cooking energy. So we are talking about very big numbers, you know, with a major impact. And more recently, again, earlier we thought it was only the respiratory problems, but you know, heart disease, cancer, all of these have been established to be caused by the indoor air pollution and from biomass burning in particular. It is possible to change the picture from what you saw a little while earlier to what you see over here. We have experimented with several cook stove models and have, recognizing the fact that, you know, different parts of our country in particular, but this applies globally, have different cultural habits, have different food consuming habits, and therefore the kinds of cooking energy solutions that they need are very different. There is a whole suite of options that we have to be able to offer people. But the biggest challenge is that we haven't invested enough in trying to understand what is the needs and then to be able to come up with a solution and to stay with it. But I think there are opportunities that are available. Technology has also progressed, so I think there is hope to be able to address this. One of the challenges that we have over here, of course, is of financing. And to be able to overcome that challenge, we looked at how we could use information technology and mechanisms. 3 years ago, we were talking about the clean development mechanism still, that could be leveraged to provide the kinds of financing resources that are required. So here is a mechanism that we developed that would allow us to monitor real time and remotely what is the use pattern of these improved cook stoves, and therefore what are the benefits that we could expect to accrue, both in terms of reduced emissions of the short-lived carbon pollutants, as also some of the other pollutants that have a health impact. But, and basically this is how it works. It just monitors the on-off time of cook stoves, depending on the heat that is generated in the device, and there is a sensor which is there embedded in the mobile device, which collects the data and sends it to remote places. So there were lots of design elements that went into this cook stove. I'm not getting into the details of it. But what it required was a great level of collaboration and many partnerships that had to be put in place to be able to devise this particular mechanism. All of this was facilitated by the UK aid, DFID as we knew it. And there are many implementation partners. The Government of India also came forward, and we are experimenting with them in sending out about 1,000 of such cook stoves in the first phase. Financial challenges are the key challenges. Technologies can be developed, but today we are competing with cook stoves, the traditional cook stoves that are made by people themselves, so there's no cost there. And they're using traditional biomass that is collected, so there's no cost there. So we are really, in one sense, looking at something which is provided free versus providing something that could cost, if I were to convert it, maybe up to $25 to $30 or $50, depending on the models that we are looking at. So those costs are very high to somebody, to people, especially in remote parts of the country, that are living under the poverty line. So this is a real challenge. And plus, there is the whole issue of opportunity cost of capital. There are other related issues that, it's the women who really suffer from the consequences of the indoor air pollution, but the financial decisions are in the hands of the men and so on. So there is a real challenge over there. There are opportunities. 60% of India, by the way, is not part of the financial system. The financial inclusion levels are maybe around 40 to 45%. So that's another big challenge that we have. But even if some of these households had access to bank and bank credit, etc., transaction costs are very high. The risk perception is very high. Policies are not in place, and returns are extremely low. So there is a whole environment that needs to be created to provide the solutions that we are talking about. On the market side, there are lots of issues for users. Because the supply chain is not functioning very well, there are not enough large industries invested in it. There is no ready stock. Confidence levels amongst consumers is low that the technology will work, and if it works, and if it runs into problems, that there is a service network to take care of those problems. Access to finance we mentioned, and the fact that technology actually is continuing to progress. So when consumers see that something is moving forward, they feel unhappy about the fact that they have been given technology which is not state of the art. So there are also these kinds of perceptions, aspirations, etc., which one has to deal with in the field. On the supply chain, no volume producers, big industry, as I mentioned. It's a highly dispersed market, and the demand that is coming up is also extremely variable. So it's very difficult to plan unless there's a very coordinated effort between governments, the regulatory framework and the policy framework, and of course the market and its development. Supply chain I mentioned. Inventory carrying costs are pretty high, and most of the entrepreneurs or traders at a local level don't have the capacity to carry these costs. So that was on cook stoves. Coming to lighting, we had launched a program called Lighting a Billion Lives in 2008, which was largely focused at that time on solar lanterns, because we recognized the challenges of providing electricity in rural areas. By the way, we invested a huge amount in extending the electricity grid in the country over the last 5 years in particular. In the last 10 years in the Congress government's term. And today we claim that 90% of the villages in India have access to the grid, but that means very little because we are not able to send electricity through those lines that have been established. It's a great example of how we have invested huge amounts of precious resources in assets that are not going to give us the value that we need. But anyway, coming back to this, solar lanterns, this you are familiar with. This was a commitment really to be able to provide basic lighting services, recognizing that apart from providing lighting, the provision of light itself has implications for education, for health, for livelihood activities, and so on. So when we talk about the Sustainable Energy for All initiative, coming back to the global for half a second, and our talking about that in the context of the definition of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the other major UN initiative that is taking place, you will see an increasing convergence between energy and all other developmental issues, and I think that is what we reflected as well. But one of the keys was that along with our program, I think parallelly, the World Bank had started major programs on lighting Africa, now lighting Asia, lighting Afghanistan, and there are other such initiatives that are being developed. So there is a huge movement around building capacity on providing the high quality lighting solutions to rural areas. And it's something that we have also invested in with a continuous feedback loop from users on what is it that they would actually need, what are the quality control challenges that we have in rural areas, and how can we overcome these. The model that we used was to set up what are called charging stations. So we did not give out lanterns to people on a grant basis. So we set it up as a service, lighting as a service that was being provided into homes. So there was an entrepreneur that was set up either in a village or a cluster of villages, and this entrepreneur ran this charging station. Essentially, it was a modular form where the charging station had the capacity. It was designed to charge 50 lanterns over the daytime period and make them available to whosoever needed it for the night to be able to get the light that they required. And they charged a particular fee, and the fee level was determined to be such that the out-of-pocket expenditure of the household was no more than what they would have spent on the alternative which they were currently using, which was kerosene. And the balance, of course, was made good through either grants from international organizations or from the corporate sector, or even individual grants that were mobilized for this purpose. Over a period of time, that whole financing model has changed substantially, and today we are able to get banks being interested, putting up money. We are able to get interest in private entrepreneurs to put up some money. So the mix of finances available for financing this kind of initiative has changed substantially in the last 5 to 6 years. By itself, the model was fairly complex and required, again, the involvement of a large number of partners. I'm not going to get into the details of this, but it's important to know that even when you're talking about something as simple as provision of lighting, it requires a concerted effort and many players coming together and public-private partnerships. And by private partnerships, I mean the large industry as also that little entrepreneur that is sitting in a shop in a village that might be providing the service that we are talking about. Over a period of time, we have succeeded in bringing down the costs substantially for these solar lanterns and improved the quality. We started with compact fluorescent lamps, and now, of course, we do have LED lanterns. There are dimming facilities and so on and so forth. So many technological improvements that have taken place. And I mentioned earlier this was possible with support from DFID, and this is really a couple of slides from there, which shows that we have been able to actually, with the limited effort of one institution that is taking the prime lead in this, we have been able to bring in quite a few of the households, about 5,300, in the last 3 years, actually, ever since the technology was improved enough to use these improved cook stoves. We were able to put in place about 102 energy entrepreneurs to take care of the servicing needs in those villages where we were providing these particular technologies. We have trained a large number of technicians for these purposes. And the number of households that we were able to reach out to was significantly higher than what we thought we would do in the early years. When we made this proposal, 200,000 is what we thought we would be at, and 324 is where we are. But that's because lighting as a sector had a head start on cooking. The interest in cooking is much more recent, so that the lead time for that was significantly larger. But it is possible to scale up these kinds of efforts. This is the kind of spread of activities that we have across the country in cooking and lighting, for cooking and lighting purposes. We are very cognizant of the different kinds of drivers that there are, and we are basically leveraging all of these to be able to achieve the kinds of scale-up that we are talking about. So right from policy advocacy to working with financial institutions to building up the partnerships at a grassroots level, I think all of this has to go in, and for us, this is a critical part of it. The interesting part of the effort that we have been involved in today is that both the central government and several state governments are coming forward and providing support, including institutional and manpower support to take these initiatives forward. So that was on lighting and cooking, and very quickly, we have also invested a fair degree in developing decentralized off-grid electricity solutions. And I'm not going to get into the details, but we have developed mini, micro, and pico grids based on AC power as also DC power, because DC power then helps to make it much more efficient for the systems that we are talking about, and have again experimented with very different models of service delivery, which are suitable for different contexts that exist in rural India. Because typically then again what happens is we tend to say urban and rural, but the diversity of contexts that we have in the rural space is actually quite mind-boggling, and the needs are so very different. When we talk about poverty levels, again, we are talking about an entire spectrum of levels of poverty. It's not just, we cannot take a binary above poverty and below poverty and assume that, it's going to solve all the problems. So the ability to finance, the ability to incur costs, the levels of education, literacy, ability to deal with technology, which might seem very simple to us. I mean, all of these are enormous challenges when we go out into the field. I still remember having a discussion as part of the Sustainable Energy for All initiative with my colleague from Africa, Abiku. I don't know how many of you would know him. But, he was a great votary for extending the grid in Africa as the solution for rural energy challenges. And his argument was that people in Africa are much more, or rural people in India are much more technology savvy as compared to what we have in Africa. That was one problem. So he said, in a number of places, technology is still considered to be voodoo science in a sense. And second, he said that we don't have the human capacity to be able to deal with the kinds of enterprise initiatives or the service providers in the context of these mini grids or smart mini grids that we are talking about. So he said, even if you're able to get the numbers of people to run these centralized services, that would be a big deal. So, I mean, those were the arguments that he made. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago. But all I'm trying to say is that these are no mean challenges. The challenge of human capacity, the challenge of comfort with technology, and of course, the whole servicing network that we are talking about. So different models that we are looking at in some of the poorest parts of India, which are actually comparable to what we have in Africa as well. And as I said, we have implemented these. Not only have we tried to understand the needs and then design systems to respond to those needs, but it is also important to put in place the mechanisms at a rural level. In most cases, we have set up what are called village energy committees. The other major challenge that we have, just to bring you up to speed on this very quickly, is that, as you are all aware, we have some fairly strong caste and community divides that still exist in India. So when we are talking about equity and equity in access, the social structure is something that very carefully needs attention. Otherwise, you do have bias even in those areas for the infrastructure that is developed. So ensuring access is not merely an issue of providing the technology. There's a lot of social engineering in a sense as well that also needs to be done. In these cases, the mini grids that we are setting up or the microgrids that are being set up are also meeting some of the livelihood needs of people for simple activities that are undertaken at a village level. So there's also a micro utility that's been set up. There's a vehicle called the Mera Gaon. Mera Gaon is My Village Power Limited. They have been running these microgrids in Sitapur district. I'll come back to that in a minute. And again, there are different mechanisms that we have put in place to ensure sustainability, the fact that once we leave from that area, the system doesn't fail. And there are even smaller grids for even smaller areas. This is in Sundarbans. There are remote villages which are highly dispersed in the Sundarbans, and they need a very different treatment as well. This is a cold storage system. This was something that we developed in collaboration with CSIRO here in Australia. And we looked at renewable energy-based small-scale cold storage and power generation systems. As, again, most of you may be familiar, India loses about 40% of its agricultural produce on an annual basis because we don't have cold storage facilities in the country, because we don't have the energy in the country, in rural areas, to be able to provide this. So this is still at a pilot demonstration phase, but we are happy that we have been able to establish this. This is a 50 kilowatt biomass gasifier system. We set up the village distribution grid because that didn't exist. While the backbone has been provided by the government, in most cases the distribution grids don't exist. And this is a 12 metric ton capacity cold storage system that we have established. There are 132 households in this particular village that we are talking about, and we have basically looked at needs, and there's an allocation of 150 watts per household that has been done. And there are certain basic infrastructure within the household that has also been provided. And there are some street lights provided for purposes of safety and security. And women, I think, have enjoyed and have come back with this feedback that it is extremely useful. Village energy committees obviously had to be formed over here as well. Very important to look at the mix, once again, as I mentioned, which was done. And yeah. Then there was also a tariff mechanism. This again is determined by the committee itself, and it of course varies. But on an average, we are talking about 15 rupees per unit, which is comparable to diesel. Diesel, I think, is around 15 to 18 rupees per unit that we have in India just now. So a number of things that go along. I just wanted to finish by saying that the energy access problem is a huge problem. There are solutions that we can come up with, technological solutions that are available. I spoke about the clean development mechanism as one way of being able to make this technology more financially accessible to communities. But there's no reason why, especially if WHO is recognizing that we have about 3.7 million deaths due to indoor air pollution, why we cannot come up with a health development mechanism that would allow us to transfer some resources from the health budget to the clean cooking energy budget and avoid the costs of treatment, and these kinds of heavy costs that we have. But there are mechanisms that are possible. And I think what we also need to understand, and the reason for mentioning the whole supply chain issues, is that while institutions like ours can do these demonstrations, can experiment with these different models, can try and bring forward an understanding of what the drivers are for decision making, for choices in these areas, eventually, at some time, large industry does have to get involved. That's where we are also able to bring down the costs of provision of these kinds of services. And I think most importantly, we need to be able to recognize that the aspiration levels of people in rural areas, those without access to energy, have gone up tremendously. Whether you find proper education in rural homes or not, you will definitely find that there's at least one television set in most places, and there is some means by which people run those television units. And there is an increasing aspiration level that is coming up. And if we are not able to meet those aspirations, we could be running into very serious social problems. So it is imperative for us to ensure that we are able to respond to some of these aspirational needs of people, apart from the whole ethical issue that is involved. So I think that is extremely important. But even from a self-interest point of view, I think it is extremely important for us to engage much more substantially. Solutions are possible, but we need to put in the effort. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Leena. That was a very, very insightful presentation. So thank you very much. I'm sure that some amazing statistics there. 40% of fresh food going to waste. I mean, just an amazing statistic. So look, I'm sure you've generated some interest and some questions in the audience's mind. I would like to introduce you to Bob Pritchard. Bob is the Managing Director of Resources Law International and Executive Director of the Energy Policy Institute of Australia. And Bob is going to come on stage, introduce our panel members, and then facilitate a Q&A session. So thanks, Bob.
Thank you, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. Can I invite up to the stage our other two panelists, Professor Gautam Yadama, who's the Director of International Programs at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis, and the author of the book Fires, Fuel and the Fate of 3 Billion that we referred to earlier, and also our own well-known figure, Professor Chris Gregg, who's the Director of UQ Energy Initiative. The Energy Policy Institute is extremely grateful to Rio Tinto and the University of Queensland for continuing to co-host this important series of lectures, which have become not to be missed events in the calendar of everyone with an interest in the energy industry in Queensland and in Australia and internationally. This morning, Dr. Srivastava's speech has depicted an energy crisis in India of just epic proportions. So to make the very best use of the time that we have, I'd request we be as economical as we can with both questions and answers, so that we can fit in as many questions as possible. Leena's been here in Australia for a day or so. She knows Aussies are very friendly people, so we've agreed to use first names. So it's Leena, Gautam, and Chris. And I'd ask you, when you ask your questions from the floor, to please frame it as a question rather than a comment, and please be concise, and please confine yourself to only one question, and please direct it to one particular person rather than the entire panel. Before we close, I'll invite each panellist to make a brief closing remark. Now, there are roving microphones around the room, so please raise your hand to attract one of them, and then please state your name and address. But I want to start off with a question of my own. Leena, you mentioned in your presentation the extraordinary level of volume of kerosene used in Indian homes. You said it was 2.2 billion litres per year. I wanted to ask you, is that kerosene use the main cause of household air pollution in India, or is it the burning of biomass? What's the sort of comparative level there?
Very quickly, I know that you asked for short answers, but the kerosene, the kerosene provisioning in the country was meant to be for cooking purposes, and that's why the subsidy was provided. But people had biomass as an alternative for cooking. They didn't have an alternative for lighting. So the kerosene which was meant for cooking was used for lighting in little wick lamps, and then that's where the pollution really comes from. But the pollution levels of kerosene wick lamp are actually not comparable to that of a biomass cook stove. And you know, characteristically also they are quite different. So while that is a problem, the use is very small as compared to what we have for in burning biomass for cooking purposes. And so one is for lighting, one is for cooking, so they're also not really substitutes over there. So we need to look at different solutions.
But they're both polluting. That's the point.
They're polluting, yes, of course they are polluting, yes.
Yeah. Do you want to add something, Gautam?
I just want to say one bit of fact about kerosene. The ultrafine particles from kerosene are far more damaging because they cross the blood organ barrier. And so young women who are pregnant under these conditions are far more likely to face extreme adverse health effects even for the infants. You know.
Thank you. Well, first question from the floor. Hand up, please. There's one here. Microphone at the front, please. The microphone is approaching.
Thank you. Nikolai Kinaev, University of Queensland. Leena, that's a question for you. What should be the optimal size of a distributed power generation for communities to satisfy both lighting, cooking, and food storage needs?
It really varies. So, you know, we need to be able to have some modularity in this, but we have households that are, we have villages that have 100 households and we have villages that have 1,000 households. So there is an entire spectrum that we have over there, but I think we are typically working with, for the poorest of these villages, about 50 kilowatts or so. That would be a good size of a unit to have. But for some of the more remote villages, we are also working with 10 kilowatt systems. So I'm afraid I won't be able to say what is the most optimal size, but we need to be able to provide a mix. And I think the smart mini grids, which I didn't have a chance to talk about, provides a real opportunity for us to be able to see how we can make this much more modular and bring in also the efficiency improvements, which is part of the sustainable energy for all goals. It is not, I mean, typically what we have been doing is using one or the other source in isolation. And as you know, for renewable energy, there is a lot of variability which comes in place, and you're not able to meet the requirements very well. Whereas if you were able to install smart grid, mini grid systems or pico grid systems, you could overcome a lot of the existing barriers in the provision of energy.
Next question. Hands, please. Yes.
Hello, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Srivastava. Stephen Wilson from Rio Tinto. You showed a slide that showed the provision of this kind of small-scale electricity for 15 rupees per kilowatt hour, which is 25 US cents per kilowatt hour. And there was also a slide showing the location of these 102 small entrepreneurial projects scattered across India, but I noticed there seemed to be none in Gujarat and none in Tamil Nadu. Is that because they can supply electricity from the grid at less than 25 US cents a kilowatt hour in those states?
Yes, I think Gujarat has done very well in terms of their electrification program, and they succeeded a while ago to actually separate the lines for providing electricity to for agricultural consumption and for rural consumption. So Gujarat has been able to make a number of investments, and they have experimented with their own models, and they are actually surplus in electricity capacities that exist. That is one, but more importantly, we started by focusing on the pockets of high poverty in the country. So that includes states like Orissa, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh. You know, it all comes in the northern, towards the eastern part, not northeast, but you know, the eastern parts of the country. These are the states where the incidence of poverty is extremely high. So we had first actually started by looking at different villages, but then the transaction costs of this effort became very high, so we started more the clustering processes. Also because servicing becomes easier, the size of the market develops, and there are a number of issues. So our focus has been concentrated in these areas, and Gujarat of course has enough, and Tamil Nadu is also doing reasonably well on electricity provisioning, but they're not at the same level as Gujarat.
Okay, next. Yes, in the back again.
Jared Ledwich, Queensland University of Technology. Leena, you mentioned about the expansion of the grid and it not being taken up, not being used. Can you explain a little bit more about what has led to that?
You know, we started a program. I won't get into the name because it's once again a very long name, typically Indian names, Rajiv Gandhi Gramin Vidyutikran Yojana, etc. It's a rural electrification program essentially. And what the government did was they said, let's set up a transmission backbone across the entire country. And that's where we decided to extend the electricity grid to within, I think it was 1 or 10 kilometers, I'm forgetting the exact number, but within reach of rural areas. And the definition of electrification, by the way, is that 10% of the households should have electricity in their homes, and that the community facilities that there are, hospitals, schools, etc., must have electricity connections. So that is the definition of a village that is electrified. It does not guarantee any supply of electricity. So we have that infrastructure which is in place with this definition of what constitutes access. But typically we are unable to provide electricity at the time when farmers or households need it the most, especially for households. For farmers, and especially around agricultural seasons, we do make exceptions. We starve industry and we provide electricity to agriculture, which is important from a food security point of view. But that's what I mean, that while we have set up the grid, we are unable to provide electricity. And I think you also need to recognize, I did not present that, at an aggregate level, at a country level, we are still about 10 to 12% short on both energy and peak capacity, the demand. So even in urban India, I live on the outskirts of Delhi, we have about 6 to 8 hours of power cut every summer season. We don't get supply of electricity in that set period. So, and that's in and around Delhi. I think if you go into other parts of the country, in urban areas as well, there are major challenges. We use a lot of diesel, which is imported. As you know, India is already about 70% import dependent. We use a lot of diesel in diesel gensets, not just for commercial purposes, but even in homes, to be able to provide that comfort of 24/7 electricity for those of us who can afford it. So there are many challenges. So extending that grid just did not make sense in this overall context, when the value for money that could have been delivered could have been significantly higher if we had invested in alternative models.
Leena, we've got a peak demand problem in this country too, but it's nothing like you just described. Yeah. Next question. This one here.
Hi, Nick Barter, Griffith University. You were just talking about energy supply, and I was struck that in the villages you were talking about 2 sockets and 3 switches or something like that. I was just trying to work out how many sockets and switches I have in my house, and I lost count. Which goes to the point of energy supply, which is I plug things in and they work. And I wanted to understand, or if you could talk to perhaps the whole panel, about how once you electrify a village, what you actually create is this perhaps growth in demand for electricity from that village. They want to plug more things in, or not, as the case may be. And I wanted to understand if there are any interesting business models that were being developed in order to meet that growing potential demand for electricity within a community.
Well, I think that's a good question. It's a question we might address to the whole panel. So, Leena, would you like to start off?
Sure. So, sorry, what was your question?
It's how do you cater for
growing
demand
demands
when people want it, when they get to the stage where they're benefited by this supply,
yes,
and they become more habit formed,
yes,
I guess, and they're expecting it when they want it.
Yes. I think that's where I spoke about the need for modularity as well. That is going to be key. And the need to develop the local level capacity, the entrepreneurs that are able to supply this electricity. Over a period of time, if you were to visualize it, you could look at all of these decentralized mini-grids, smart mini-grids, as the case may be, joining up with the overall centralized grid if our situation improves to that level. Right now, they need to be ring-fenced entities, and we need to be able to create that. So that is going to be extremely important. Secondly, I have always maintained, even in the Sustainable Energy for All meetings, that I briefly mentioned, the ethical aspects in here. We sit over here in rooms, in the Planning Commission in India, in other places, and we decide that energy access equals 30 units of electricity per month per household, or 6 cylinders of LPG for cooking purposes, etc. Why should we do that? Yeah. I mean, why are we determining what it is that we consume and what is it that is adequate to constitute energy access, which is not necessarily demand responsive? And so if somewhere we had in the Sustainable Energy for All initiative looked at a definition of what constitutes energy access, and there was enormous debate on where is it that we should peg this figure. Is it 30 units, 50 units? UNDESA argued for 100 units, etc. So there was an entire spectrum on which we were unable to arrive at a consensus. And I said, you really need to be able to create that environment such that if demand increases, you are able to respond to it. And that demand should increase because, and you are right that this will grow, but because once you provide energy, livelihoods improve, the paying capacity improves, aspiration improves, and with education, etc., there will be a feedback loop. But we have a very poor understanding of how all of these feedback loops work and how demand grows. This is a current research project that we have going on in the institute to try and understand better the dynamics of demand growth. But that it will happen, there is no doubt about. How it will happen is a challenge to understand and plan for. But if you create the environment, then you can respond to it.
Okay, good time.
So I'll just pick up on the last point. Part of your question was what happens once you start providing electricity. Well, I think there's also, demand is not unipolar. I mean, there's a gender differentiated nature to this demand. Who's demanding and what kind of energy are they demanding, for what purposes, and how do they use it? So I think that is also something that one has to disentangle. So this is where, again, more systematic work on systems that are driving and the structure, the underlying structure that drives behavior around energy use, demand for energy, types of energy, and so on, is something very critical. We are, just like Terry, Washington University with its partners in India, and I'm also inviting University of Queensland to join us. We're actually doing some system dynamics in rural areas in India where we're trying to figure out from end users what actually drives this differentiated demand. How do people leapfrog from certain energy technologies to other types of technologies from the perspective of women, men, and so on. So we're actually building these simulation models and using them later to inform not only policy and policy scenarios, but also in the kind of interventions we would like to undertake to study what is effective and scalable and sustainable.
That's a very bottom-up approach towards energy technology development, isn't it? And Chris, would you like to come in?
Probably what I'd like to do is put it in the context of people in this room. When our colleagues talk about energy access, they're talking about a level of supply which I use in 2 days per year. So this is all of the electricity that a household gets for their whole year, I use in 2 days. Well, I and my son in a two-person household. So that actually is just what I need for lighting and for comfort of living. It actually doesn't mean anything about productive enterprises and industrialisation. So there's a whole nother level of access that India needs to go through after providing a living standard if they're going to emerge from poverty in reality, is that industrialisation and productive enterprise. And so that just means the nature of this task is very long-term and very large.
Okay, well, we've got...
Bob, could I
sorry,
just
yes?
say one thing? Leena mentioned 6 to 8 hours in a certain season. She's talking per day.
Yeah.
daily 6 to 8 hours of power cuts.
Okay.
Just
good.
want to be
Thank
sure.
you. Well, we've got time for 2 more questions. So, who's the next? There's one over here, I think. I think it's Simon, is it? It's hard for me to see from here with all these lights. Oh, one here, and then Simon to finish, perhaps.
Hi,
Yes.
Sorry, Neil Gardner from Arrow Energy. Leena, thanks very much. Very good presentation. You mentioned about the caste system that's still embedded in India and how it causes challenges for you when rolling out energy. Just wonder if you could explain more on what kind of challenges you face and how you're trying to address those.
So we were working on a project that looked at overall infrastructure development in rural areas, which is roads, water supply systems, energy, etc., in Gujarat, coincidentally, and along with the Gujarat government, of course. And we found that in a number of instances, schools were located in particular communities, and the access to schools to people from other communities, was obviously limited because they could not trespass into those areas and so on. So these differences are very strong. I know you would find it very strange. And then there are religious divides, there are income divides, and there are these caste divides. So there are different kinds of issues. And then there is this road that passes through the village that kind of divides the village into 2, again based on certain characteristics of the communities over there. And there's a marked difference between the provisioning of services in one part of the village vis-a-vis the other. And these are actually traditional biases that have come down over a period of time. And it requires intervention to be able to overcome that. So the resources that flow into villages, they are at risk of being appropriated by the stronger people in the village.
Okay, next question. Did you have one, Simon?
Do you want to add to that?
So Simon Wensley from Rio Tinto. So maybe this is to Leena and Gautam. You've talked about the backbone of transmission being at least partially there, but still even in your own experience, lack of actual supply. I mean, what has to change in a more macro sense in India to allow power stations to be built and of whatever technology to be supplying into that Indian grid? What should we be looking out for that signals there's a change and an ability for India to actually start to meet its larger, bigger base load of power requirements?
Just to share with you the macro picture, typically India works on a 5-year plan period. So if you look at the last 3 5-year plans, not going further back, I think we have managed to set up capacities that are varying between 30 to 50% of the targets that we had each year for new capacity that is to be set up. So we are continuing to add to this gap between demand and supply over a period of time. What do we need for being able to fill up this gap? I think one of the biggest challenges that we have faced in the last 5 to 7 years is fuel supply. And our inability, even the private sector, although India has opened up to private sector participation, even though the private sector has stepped forward, they have not been able to convince the financial institutions that they have fail-proof fuel supply agreements. And I think the whole situation was not helped by what happened with the ultra mega power projects in the country set up by at least 2 of our groups, Tata's and Reliance, that got into fuel supply agreements, not fuel supply agreements, that purchased coal mines in Indonesia and on certain assumptions, and then there were policy changes that took place and the cost of that fuel went up and they were left with stranded assets because they had agreed to supply electricity at a particular cost with fuel not being a pass-through cost, and found that they were unable to meet that particular commitment. So for 4,000 megawatts plus 4,000 megawatts, that's a huge capacity that was under tremendous risk. There have been some changes in policy since then in India. But we need to be able to ensure fuel supplies. I think that is becoming one major problem. Second, of course, is the transportation infrastructure. I mentioned that we are already about 70% import dependent on oil. Our import dependency on coal is going up quite substantially because we are not able to exploit the coal resources that we have in the country because of a variety of social and environmental challenges that are coming up, and also because India was extremely optimistic about its coal resources. So that's another major challenge, the transportation infrastructure. So if you're going to be importing a lot more, and from the energy economy model projections that we have done up to the year 2032, we expect that India would be about 95% dependent on oil imports by the year 2032, that our coal import dependency would also go up to about 60%. That's huge. We're talking about 1,500 million tons possibly of coal being imported into the country if we were to continue along this path. So we really have to see what are the alternatives and what is it that we can do about nuclear energy, or to what extent we can exploit the substantial renewable energy sources that we have in the country.
Okay, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to make a closing remark, but just before I do, is there one final short question from the floor that anyone has? No, but I've got a very quick one of my own. That is, you did mention then nuclear. Do you see nuclear as having a significant role in India in the future, Leena?
India needs to have nuclear energy because of the sheer scale of demand and the challenges that we have on the environmental side. Now, whether we are able to convert that need into reality and an actual capacity is something we'll have to take a look at, because we have to be able to address the social concerns that there are around nuclear energy in the country. And the government has done, and utilities have done, a very poor job of engaging with local level communities and in building their trust and confidence in that technology. So, unless we address that, I don't see the kinds of major requirements that we have for nuclear energy really coming into place.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to ask the panelists now to make a closing remark. And I think I might start actually with you. I think, Chris, if you go first, then Gautam, and then Leena, you've got the final word. So, Chris.
Yeah, I think this is a conversation that needed to start in Australia. Our headlines are dominated by two things: the cost of electricity and climate change. And we're not actually going to solve any of the global problems like climate change until we deal with, or try to have the conversation in the same group, that we have 3.5 billion people who lack any kind of reasonable access to any kind of energy. And until we face up to that, I think tackling the problem of climate change is actually virtually impossible. So I think Australia, and the same holds true in the US and Europe, it's time to say, yes, we have big issues that are local, but we actually are a part of the world and we have to be a part of the solution, and that includes providing energy access.
Gautam.
So I'd like to make a couple points from the macro to the micro. All of this discussion we've been having this morning and your presentation, Leena, coursing through it is this issue of provision of public goods. And provision of public goods means a state that is accountable, a state that can be held accountable, and here governance becomes an issue. And governance is a big aspect of this discussion. Who is keeping the government and the policies and the quality of the public policy around energy? How is it being derived is very critical. So you just look at supply of water on farms, irrigation. I mean, it probably puts a big burden on electricity provision, because pumping irrigation water by farmers, it's a very politically charged issue. But it's also a policy that has driven water resources to nothing in some places, while driving up costs of electricity and so on. So we have to think about those issues in this context. The other, at the micro level, is what Chris has just mentioned. What needs to happen for communities and for these very millions and billions of poor to actually come into a system that they feel works for them, that enables and unleashes a level of productivity that takes the next generation out of this poverty trap. So I think we have to work on both ends, and that's why it's a wicked problem.
Well, Leena, do you have a final message to leave with us?
Well, just very quickly, I guess the whole issue of capacity, I've mentioned it at various times, but I think we need to be able to build capacity across all our institutions, whether it is government, whether it is regulatory bodies, financial institutions, or just the private enterprise itself. The need for capacity building, the need to be able to think out of the box and come up with alternative models for energy service provisioning, not energy provisioning, I think is going to be critical.
So it's not just technology, it's technology and everything that goes with it. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone in the room for participating today. Could I please now ask Professor Peter Hoy, the Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Queensland, up to close the event.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I do have a prepared speech, but I don't think I want to contaminate the great insights that you've been given by the ones that actually know what they're talking about. So instead, I would just like to, first of all, thank all of you for yet again turning up to what I think has been a very informative breakfast. Thank you, Leena, for insights that we need to have. Your talk reminded me about something I heard on ABC radio about 8 months ago about an electricity blackout in India, and shock horror, we heard that 300 million people were now without electricity in India. I think they were before the blackout as well. So what that brings me to is that we actually need to have an enormous amount of knowledge to tackle what is not a local problem, but a global problem, as Chris has outlined. Now, we are extremely privileged at UQ to have partnered with Rio Tinto to be able to put on these events, and with the Energy Institute as well. And we hope that this will continue. You might well ask why UQ is a partner, and many of you might not know that UQ actually is the university in Australia that is highest rated for research quality across the most broad field of research endeavours that you can have. We're also the university in Australia with the largest amount of research support coming from industry, and it is a very broad church. We bring together experts that actually do not fight inside the walls of UQ, but debate appropriately. So we have Chris Greig, who, as you have heard, has had a significant experience outside the university and works on things such as carbon capture and storage. We have Professor Eric McFarland from the Dow Institute of Sustainable Engineering with his PhD in nuclear technology from MIT, and in his spare time he uses his MD from Harvard to do good as well. And then, of course, we have Professor Ove Gullberg, who is the leader of our Global Change Institute, but also on the IPCC, worrying a lot about what happens to the coral reefs. These people come together in what is called the UQ Energy Initiative, and we got to get all these people together to try to learn from each other to come up with a global solution. Now, this cannot happen inside a think tank, whether it be at Terry or UQ. It has to happen with politicians, an informed public, and very, very importantly, industry representatives such as you. And we thank you for the privilege to engage with universities. We benefit a lot from it, and in return, we hope that we can give you at least a modicum of benefit as well, so we can continue to talk. So thank you very much for coming today, and could I please ask you to join me in thanking the presenters, and in particular Leena. I thought it was a very informative morning. Thank you.